Welcome to a Rice University digital media production. For more information about us, please visit our website at www.rice.edu.
So welcome to everyone. I am just so delighted to see you all here, and of course I am thrilled, as are we all, that the weather has been so cooperative and the humidity is so low. This is a really auspicious setting for this new experimental format for our Scientia colloquia. I'm Susan McIntosh, the director of Scientia, and this year, once again, the Centennial has provided the inspiration for our theme, which is the power of ideas, since ideas and the variety of processes of inventing, developing, critiquing, testing, transforming, rebutting, transmitting, and implementing them are the very heart and soul of the university. In keeping with Sciencia's mission to nurture a broadly interdisciplinary space here on campus, to build a sense of community, and to spotlight our faculty, we wanted to invite a significant number of faculty from all over campus to participate in this series, which meant reducing the length of the talks. We've asked each speaker to focus on an idea that has powerfully influenced and intellectually engaged them. This idea does not need to be related to their research, and to speak about it for 5 minutes without PowerPoint providing visual backup. This is a challenge for many of us. And it is a challenging format that calls on the classic art of rhetoric and the modern skill of the elevator pitch. I'm indebted to our 4 exceptional speakers today for accepting this challenge. I know we're all keen to hear what they have to say, so without further ado, and in keeping with the brevity of today's proceedings, without extensive introductions for each speaker, let's begin. Again, in our experimental mode, we are dispensing with questions for each speaker in the hope that you will stay and mingle at the reception that follows and share your thoughts with colleagues, including our speakers. So, our first speaker is Mahmoud Amin El-Gamal, professor of economics and statistics and chair of Islamic economics, finance, and management, speaking on social capital and finance.
Thank you, Susan. It's a challenge to ask a professor to speak for only 5 minutes, so I'll try to speak quickly. When the late French sociologist and anthropologist Pierre Bourdieu coined the term social capital, he endowed it with a negative connotation, reminiscent of today's cabal of London investment bankers who are just convicted of manipulating the world's interest rates in order to turn a profit for their investors. For Bourdieu, social and cultural capital shape society in ways to ensure continued superiority of its current elites who control these as well as other forms of capital. But as the concept of social capital migrated over to American sociology, political science, and economics, the term quickly acquired unequivocally positive connotations of trust, reciprocity, and collective action. You've probably all heard of, if you haven't read, Robert Putnam's famous best-selling book, Bowling Alone. The late Lynn Ostrom argued, and Rick Wilson is here, he's one of her most brilliant students. The late Lynn Ostrom argued that the miracle of social capital is that, unlike material forms of capital, it can be used without being depleted. Ostrom was right, of course, that social capital can be used without being depleted, but it can also be used in ways that consume it irreversibly. One of these ways may be today's microfinance. It's practiced by many organizations. You've probably heard of Grameen Bank and its well-intentioned founder, who's dubbed himself Banker for the Poor. Providers of microfinance make very small loans to very poor villagers, most of whom repay these loans at any cost. They use variations on group lending and peer monitoring in order to leverage the social capital of these small communities of villagers in lieu of collateral that other borrowers from regular banks would have. And by still leveraging social capital, they actually have very low rates of default, and indeed the practice is quite profitable for the bankers. Popular perceptions and Nobel Peace Prizes notwithstanding, 30 years of economic research have yet to provide any evidence that microfinance actually does help the poor get out of poverty. However, some researchers over the past decade have found evidence that levels of social capital translate into high levels of repayment of loans, of the microloans, and conversely, and most recently, some evidence has been found that engagement with microfinance can in fact increase social capital, at least among the groups of borrowers. In sharp contrast, however, our early research now is uncovering preliminary evidence that villages that are frequented by microfinance banks tend to have lower overall levels of reciprocity and trust, i.e. they have lower levels of social capital overall, even if the small groups have high levels. One possibility for why this happens is that in monetizing the poor's social capital to turn a profit for the banks, the poor may become, like the rest of us, dependent on bank credit. And thus they are left without the ancient safety nets that they have developed over centuries, nakedly exposed to the dangers of the global business cycle. So our ongoing research examines the usefulness of formalizing the ancient organic mutual credit and insurance institutions that have existed for at least centuries, possibly millennia, to give the poor a fighting chance against the forces of financial integration and the devastating dangers of global recessions and credit crunches to which they are exposed once they are integrated in the financial system. Of course, a village credit union, which is what we're trying to establish right now, which is also an investment in social capital, has the deck stacked against it when competing with professional bankers that have access to unlimited liquidity, currently at zero interest rates. But like financial Sisyphus, overwhelming odds of failure should not be a reason to give up. So we're still working to create these village-level credit unions so that credit and insurance do not dry up when the business cycle turns. Thank you.
All right, so that was brilliantly kept to time with even, I think, a minute to spare. All right, our next speaker is Sarah Whiting, Dean and William Ward Watkins Professor of Architecture in the School of Architecture.
So, I'm going to take that extra minute from you. I have to say, I'm amazed at making TED Talks seem epic in their length by this whole format, but I also really love the idea of creating a speaker's corner at Rice, and I think this is actually something that we should consider just keeping here and allowing anyone to speak for 5 minutes, no more. I'm going to talk, actually, I'm not going to be quite as tightly organized as you were. I appreciate your tightness. I will watch the clock, which I think is moving. So I'll tell you that after 9/11, one thing that, as someone interested in architecture and urban planning, one thing that struck me in the conversations after 9/11 was that almost universally, everyone thought that the superblock that had marked the World Trade Center towers should be eliminated, and that even the people who said that the towers should be rebuilt as they were, said that the original street bridge should be put through at the World Trade Center. And I noticed, so this was almost universal, and I was really struck by the fact that the one comment, so modern architecture was criticized, there was sort of general relief in a way that these towers had been taken down in a certain way, obviously, putting that in context. But the other thing that had been criticized very, very clearly was the idea of this superblock. That gets you thinking. If everyone agrees with something, something's got to be wrong. So I started wondering, so what actually is a superblock? And strangely, the definition of a superblock comes not from an urban setting, but from 1928, when Clarence Stein and Henry Wright did Radburn, which was the first garden city built in America, and it's Radburn, New Jersey, not far from New York City. And that was, the term superblock was coined with this urban development And there's a beautiful quote from when it was a quote that came in the press that said, describing Radburn, which is a garden city. It's essentially the beginning of suburbia as we know it, with the winding streets and the very big blocks. But this quote said, take a New York City block, 200 feet by 600 feet, and you gotta pay attention to this, pump ambition to lead a better life into it until it expands to 10 to 15 times its present area, say till it measures over 1,000 feet on one side and nearly 2,000 on the other. And then you have a superblock. Unbelievable, the idea of taking a New York City block and pumping more ambition into it, and that's a definition of a superblock. But so what's interesting to me is that the superblock comes from a suburban, it's a term that we consider to be urban, it comes from a suburban background. My interest in large things in cities has extended for a long time. I've long been interested in simply how do you insert big things into cities? And so my interest in the World Trade Center site was simply the reverse of that, of simply how did it ever come to happen that you had that big a piece of property in Manhattan to begin with? And if you look at this is generally, I think, an interesting question. If you think to look at Houston, our own example, Discovery Green is a good example. So that part of Houston was an industrial part of the city. It was part of trail yards, train station yards that were east of downtown. In the 70s, Texas Eastern, which is a gas pipeline, acquired 32 blocks of that area, of that industrial area. So oftentimes big sites in cities have industrial origins or have corporate buyers who have bought up that much land. In the 70s, they bought these 32 acres. In the 80s, they gave 4 blocks to the city for the George R. Brown Convention Center. And in 2002, they sold 2 parking lots adjacent to the Convention Center to the city, which in 2004, thanks to the desire of 2 philanthropic organizations, the Brown Foundation and the Kinder Institute, was turned into Discovery Green, into a park. So you get this history of this site. These are the 2 blocks, these 2 surface parking areas were turned into a park. If you look at the grid of Houston, you'll see that Discovery Green is bigger than a typical city block. And part of what I'm asking in understanding sort of the importance of the superblock in our understanding of the city is just seeing how do those big pieces of property come to be and how do they get treated in the city as these insertions. Has to do with money, has to do with buying property, has to do with politics. And it has to do with visions for how these big things can affect a city. This feeds into my larger, I have literally 30 seconds left, my larger research project, which looks at such superblocks within Chicago, understanding the Chicago grid as a grid that is able to absorb these large projects. For example, IIT's, the Illinois Institute of Technology's campus, which is a 100-acre campus that was acquired. That land was acquired by having the Board of Trustees buy land sort of out of their back pockets and give it to the university, completely illegal today. But again, if you think of how do these big projects exist, it's again it's issues of politics, economics, and the city. And so I leave you with that question of sort of understanding how architecture intersects those other disciplines. And my time is up.
Thank you. Next speaker is Anthony Brandt, Associate Professor of Composition and Theory, Shepherd School of Music, speaking on why minds need art.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here with all of you. Do minds need art? Some scientists say no. Neuroscientist Steven Pinker famously remarked that the arts serve, quote, no biological utility and serve only to tickle the pleasure centers of the brain. Some politicians say no. They don't feel it's worth investing in our country's artists and art institutions. And some educators say no. When budgets are cut, the arts are often the first to go. As a composer, I've been deeply concerned by the declining value of the arts. They're too often treated as a luxury and arts education as a matter of special opportunity or privilege. Like everyone in the arts, I'm convinced that minds need art. I think some recent developments in brain science are beginning to show why. Baylor neuroscientist and Rice alum Dr. David Eagleman divides brain behavior into two basic types, automated and mediated. In automated behavior, the brain streamlines neural networks for reliability and efficiency. The goal is to produce the same outcome every time. That's why habits are so hard to break. The brain has literally pruned away the options. Automated behavior is largely unconscious, and we share this capacity with every living being with a brain. In contrast, in mediated behavior, the brain tolerates redundancy and promotes networking. The goal is flexibility and innovation, a new answer each time. Different neural circuits collaborate on a solution. Eagleman terms this the team of rivals model of the brain and compares it to a parliamentary debate. Humans have an unsurpassed capacity for mediated behavior. It's what distinguishes us from all other living creatures. Mediated behavior is the neurological basis of creativity. We generally call creativity by different names. The arts, for instance, are often viewed as involving distinct skills and methods. Several years ago, Dr. Mark Turner, a cognitive scientist from Case Western, gave a lecture at Rice. He was the first person I had ever heard propose that all creativity could be united into a single cognitive framework. Dr. Eagleman was coming at mental life from a neurological perspective, and Dr. Turner from a cognitive one, but I realized they were converging on the same conclusion. Creativity is a generalized feature of human behavior, and simple underlying mechanisms can be used to describe it. Inspired by their ideas, I'm in the process of developing a way to use a unified model of creativity to integrate the arts more strongly in the curriculum and to advocate for its importance to society. It begins with the assertion that an exact copy involves no creativity. If I copy your computer file, I'm not being creative. So creativity involves an alteration of some kind. I'd like to propose that all creativity involves a combination of three basic types of alteration: bending, breaking, and blending. Bending is a distortion or transformation of the original. Often the original is still recognizable. Breaking consists of shattering a whole into pieces and making something new out of some or all of the pieces. And blending is the merging of two or more sources. In language, exaggeration is a type of bending. It's bending the truth. Free verse is an example of breaking the rules of syntax, and all metaphors are blends. Individual arts, a caricature is an example of bending, cubism an example of breaking, and a collage an example of blending. In narratives, characters in disguise are examples of bending. Murder mysteries involve breaking, and any story with humans and aliens or humans and dinosaurs involves blending. Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy of blending, two people who weren't supposed to fall in love do so. In music, variation is bending, fragmentation of a theme is breaking, and counterpoint, the playing of several themes at the same time, is blending. It's the job of the arts to bend, break, and blend, and that's why we will always need new art. I feel the 3Bs model has particular value to the curriculum for the following reasons. First, Albert Einstein once said, if you can't explain it to 6-year-olds, you don't understand it yourself. The 3Bs model is a way of explaining creativity to 6-year-olds. Second, it prevents the cherry-picking of the arts in the schools. It requires all of them to be taught together. Third, it provides a coherent way to connect the arts to other core subjects. In biology, mutation is bending, death and decay are breaking, and sex is blending. In the social sciences, the civil rights era was an example of creative politics. Laws were bent and broken, integration is blending. Finally, I think the 3Bs model is a way to raise public consciousness about the arts. Minds need art because human thinking is an art form. Creativity is not a luxury, it's a fundamental feature of human behavior. It's running 24 hours a day. In fact, we have trouble turning it off. The arts are the external expression of internal brain processes that we all share. The more we realize that we are all creative, the more likely we are to value the arts and require them for ourselves and our children.
Wonderful. Our last speaker is Naomi Hollis, Stanley Seymour Professor in Electrical and Computer Engineering and Director of the Laboratory for Nanophotonics, speaking on innovation fallout.
Thank you very much. this is an interesting opportunity. When I was asked to do this, I started to think, well, about the timing of this, and the timing is, of course, late September, early October. No, it doesn't actually correspond to Oktoberfest. Oktoberfest is earlier, but it does correspond to the Nobel Prizes. And so we're just coming up on, just in a couple weeks, coming up on Nobel Prize season. So I began to think about discovery and innovation, and about this long road between what discoveries were and the ultimate Nobel Prize. And if you look through scientific discoveries, or if you look at innovations, inventions, you begin to see really some very interesting, remarkable similarities. And what I'm going to do is share with you several anecdotes, several stories, based on what happens after an innovation or after a discovery. So I'm going to combine scientific discoveries with inventions, because they're so often categorized in a similar way. So basically, there's two things that happen. Okay? Usually, there's either nothing happens, or there's opposition. So rarely are there, the triumph that we see of people getting the Nobel Prize. It is so very, very rare that that happens without either long periods of essentially neglect, or long periods of suffering and opposition and spirited spirited opposition, basically. So when you think about the major discoveries that changed the world, and you begin to look at how they were, at the scenario that played out, you begin to see both of these scenarios over and over again. And one of the reasons that you see them, so scenario A, where nothing happens. So why would nothing happen if somebody discovers something that could change the world? And very often it's because that discovery is really completely by accident, or perhaps it is. Or also timing is an important factor. But the one canonical example of this, I think, one of the canonical examples is, of course, the discovery of penicillin. Okay, so Alexander Fleming was not trying to discover penicillin at all. He was a really messy bacteriologist, basically, and he was already interested in another problem that resulted from a chance discovery. He was interested in whether or not humans had produced antibacterial chemicals in their saliva and in their body. And then one of the reasons he was interested in that was because as he was studying bacteria before this, a few years before the discovery of penicillin, he accidentally dropped some snot into his bacteria, and he discovered that in fact snot has antibacterial properties, and that, for those of you who are molecularly inclined, he was actually discovering the protein lysozyme, for which he's credited. So the discovery of penicillin is a whole lot of interesting errors. He didn't have his own lab. He shared his lab space with somebody else. So he left for a 3-week vacation, so he stacked all his bacteria cultures on the side so somebody else could use the lab space. The person on the floor before was growing mold because he was interested in studying the effect of molds on asthma sufferers. And so the idea that molds would now come in and interact with bacteria was not something that anyone thought of, or certainly was something that, as he was taking his dishes and throwing them in the disinfectant, because clearly they had become contaminated, he just happened to notice, before he got rid of a few of them, he happened to notice that there were some where the mold, he didn't know what mold, because it was something grown downstairs, where some mold had actually killed the bacteria. He wrote it down, he published a short paper, and nothing happened. And nothing happened because it was 1929 and there was an economic depression. Until 1940, and other chemists who were really had a completely different skill set, they picked up on this discovery completely independently, having read the original paper, and they picked up on this, and then and finally he, along with those two chemists, eventually won the Nobel Prize. So there's a host of interesting stories about that. Another story is radar. So this was the Naval Research Lab, and there were two engineers, and they wanted to study pulsed radio waves. And so the only place to do that at NRL was to put one to put your transmitter on one side of the Potomac and to put your receiver on the other side of the Potomac. And so they were doing experiments with pulsed radio waves, and they noticed that every time a ship passed up the Potomac, it would totally screw up their experiments. And the only ships that go up and down the Potomac at that particular region of the Potomac were Navy ships. So they asked for a meeting with the Rear Admiral, and they said, please, could you give us a schedule of when you're sending Navy vessels, because they keep screwing up our experiments. And his mouth dropped open, and he said, you mean you can tell me when the Navy ships are going up and down the river from your radio wave? So another reason why, why nothing happens is because people make discoveries and they don't even realize the importance of their discoveries. And another example of not knowing the importance of discoveries are some of the discoveries that have become so important that we use them for many things. And I think a classical example of this is the laser. So the laser was discovered, and there was a race to invent the laser. There were several groups, and Nobel Prize was given right away. It was considered an extraordinary scientific accomplishment, but nobody knew what to do with it. Not even the inventors really knew what to do with it. And one of the inventors, Art Shallow, told a very funny story of the first time he ever heard of an application of the laser was when he was in a New York City taxi, and the taxi driver told him, oh yeah, so they're using lasers to drill holes in the nipples of baby bottles. So my time is up. I probably have about a half hour more of other interesting stories, but the basic point is that discovery and innovation often are unexpected. And if you set yourself in a very organized life or an organized pattern in your laboratory, if you don't notice that unusual thing, that unusual spot on the wall, or the device that doesn't behave quite right, if you ignore those things and you go along and you're nice, check off all the things you need to do in your checklist, you just might be missing some extraordinary discovery. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I think we've had a wonderful demonstration on the part of all four speakers of how many truly fundamental and in some cases jaw-dropping ideas can be fit into 5 minutes. I want to thank them all. I want to invite you all over to our reception, and please talk to the speakers about what you've heard, talk to one another about what you heard. That's one of the functions of our great university here, and one that Scientia works very hard to promote. So thank you all for coming, and we will look forward to seeing you, I hope, next time, when we'll be just outside the Brockstein during the centennial celebration on Friday afternoon, October 12th, at 4 p.m. So hope to see you then. Thanks again.
This program is protected by copyright and may not be redistributed in whole or in part without the express written consent of Rice University Digital Media Services.